Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories, and tonight we're going somewhere truly strange, somewhere between a government bunker, a San Francisco basement, and the inside of a very confused brain. Tonight's topic is LSD, the little molecule that somehow managed to terrify the CIA, birth an entire counterculture, and convince a generation of people that they were one with the universe while sitting on a beanbag chair in 1968. So before we go any further, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because someone out there is definitely listening to this at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I respect that deeply. Let's take a moment. Have you ever wondered how a substance that was invented by accident ended up in the water supply of American foreign policy? Did the government actually think they could control people's minds with a drug that makes colours taste like music? What exactly were a group of Harvard professors thinking when they handed psychedelics to their students and called it research? Did the hippies genuinely believe LSD would end the Cold War? Or were they just really, really high? Could you have survived a secret CIA dosing in a Baltimore hotel room in 1953 without knowing you were part of the experiment? And most importantly, how does a tiny tab of paper smaller than your thumbnail end up on the FBI's most wanted list, in the Vatican's nightmares, and somehow also in the origin story of the personal computer? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1943. A Swiss chemist is gripping a bicycle handlebar for dear life. The walls of his house are breathing, and somewhere in a government office thousands of miles away, a man in a suit is already writing down ideas about how this could be useful. The strangest trip in modern history has officially begun. Good luck. The story of LSD does not begin with a counterculture, a protest march, or a rock festival. It begins with a Swiss chemist, a laboratory in Basel, and a Friday afternoon in April of 1943 that nobody involved was prepared for. Albert Hofmann was a meticulous, serious-minded scientist working for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, and he was not the type of man who did things by accident. He had spent years carefully synthesizing compounds derived from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain, in search of something medically useful, a respiratory stimulant perhaps, or a circulatory aid. 5 years earlier, he had already synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide, catalogued it as LSD-25, noted that the test animals seemed restless, and moved on. What happened when he returned to it in 1943 would change the world in ways neither he nor anyone else could have possibly mapped on a clipboard. The ergot fungus, for context, is not the kind of thing you want to meet in a dark alley. It grows on rye and other grains and has been causing problems for human beings for centuries. In the Middle Ages, communities that ate bread contaminated with ergot experienced mass hallucinations, convulsions, and a burning sensation in the limbs so severe it was called St. Anthony's fire. Entire villages would descend into collective madness, convinced they were seeing visions, hearing voices, and being chased by things that were not there. Some historians believe ergot contamination was behind several famous episodes of supposed demonic possession. So in a sense, the connection between rye fungus and altered consciousness was not new. Hofmann was simply the first person to isolate exactly which part of it was doing the work. On the afternoon of April 16, 1943, Hofmann was resynthesizing LSD-25 for reasons he described as a peculiar presentiment, a scientific hunch that he had overlooked something interesting the first time around. At some point during the process, a trace amount of the compound was absorbed through his fingertips. He did not know this had happened. What he knew was that he suddenly felt dizzy, restless, and mildly dreamlike, and that by the time he cycled home from the laboratory, the world had begun doing things that the world was not supposed to do. Colours became more vivid, shapes shifted at the edges, The ceiling of his house moved in ways that ceilings do not typically move. He lay down on his sofa and experienced, as he later described it, a stream of fantastic images of extraordinary plasticity and vividness, accompanied by an intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. He was not frightened exactly, but he was a scientist, and a scientist who has just experienced his laboratory ceiling turning into a living painting takes notes. He wrote up the experience carefully and returned to work the following Monday with one primary question. What precisely had just happened to him, and at what dose? Here is where Hofmann did something that was either admirably rigorous or spectacularly reckless, depending on your perspective. He decided to find out deliberately. He would synthesize the compound again, measure a careful dose, take it intentionally, and document the results. This was, in the framework of 1940s pharmaceutical research, not an unreasonable approach. Self-experimentation was common. Scientists regularly tested compounds on themselves before moving to clinical trials. The problem, as Hofmann was about to discover, was that he had dramatically underestimated how powerful LSD-25 actually was. What Hofmann stumbled into that April afternoon was not just a new compound. He had found a key that opened a door most people did not know existed, a door into the architecture of human consciousness itself. And like most doors that open unexpectedly, this one was very difficult to close again. The world, as Hofmann had known it on the morning of April 16th, 1943, was gone. Something new had taken its place. It just did not have a name yet. If you have ever had a moment where something starts out perfectly fine and then takes a very sharp left turn before you fully understand what is happening, then you already have a small, extremely mild, completely legal sense of what Albert Hofmann experienced on April 19th, 1943. 3 days after his accidental exposure in the lab, Hofmann decided, and this part is important, to do it on purpose. He was a scientist, after all. He wanted to verify what he had experienced. He was thorough like that. So he measured out what he calculated to be a cautiously small dose of LSD-25, 250 micrograms, which, as he would shortly discover, was in fact an enormous amount, roughly 2 to 5 times what would later be considered a strong recreational dose. At approximately 4:45 in the afternoon, Hofmann swallowed the dose dissolved in water, sat down at his laboratory bench, and began making notes. For the first 40 minutes, nothing happened. Then, as he wrote in his journal with the understatement of a man who had not yet fully grasped what was coming, I began to perceive an unceasing stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense, kaleidoscopic play of colours. He asked his laboratory assistant to accompany him home. Automobiles were unavailable due to wartime restrictions, so they travelled by bicycle. This is the part of the story that has since become legend. A Swiss chemist pedalling through the streets of Basel, while reality performed increasingly elaborate acrobatics around him. Faces of passers-by took on strange expressions. The familiar streets of the city became alien and threatening. The distance between his laboratory and his house, a journey he'd made hundreds of times before, felt endless. He was simultaneously moving forward and going nowhere, trapped in a loop of distorted time and space, gripping his handlebars as if the bicycle itself was the only stable thing left in the universe. By the time he arrived home, Hofmann was convinced he was dying. This is not a metaphor. He genuinely believed, in the grip of the experience, that he had poisoned himself and that his body was shutting down. He asked his assistant to call a doctor. He lay on his sofa and experienced what he later described as a demon who had taken possession of his mind, twisting and scattering his perceptions in every direction. His neighbour, a woman he had known for years, brought him milk to drink. a traditional remedy for poisoning. In his altered state, she appeared to him wearing a grotesque mask. The world outside his window had become a threatening, phantasmagoric place in which every known landmark had been replaced by something unrecognizable. The doctor arrived, examined him, found no physical emergency, and essentially reported that Hofmann's vital signs were fine and that whatever was happening to him, it was not killing him. Slowly, over the next several hours, the terror gave way to something else. The hallucinations continued but shifted in quality, becoming, as Hofmann described, more beautiful, more extraordinary. He slept, eventually, and woke the next morning feeling, by his account, refreshed and clear-headed, with the world looking fresh and new and more vivid than usual, as if someone had cleaned the lens through which he perceived everything. April 19th is now known in psychedelic culture as Bicycle Day, observed annually by people who find something worth commemorating in the image of a meticulous Swiss chemist cycling through the visual chaos of his own discovery. Hofmann himself lived to reflect on it for more than 60 years. He called LSD his problem child, a molecule he had created that had gotten away from him, and that he spent the rest of his very long life trying to help the world understand a little better. For most companies, discovering that one of their employees had accidentally absorbed a mind-altering substance through his fingertips and then cycled home through visual hallucinations would be cause for a very serious HR meeting. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, to their eternal historical significance, had a different reaction entirely. They were intrigued. Hofmann's experience, documented, detailed, and written with the careful precision of a man who took notes even while the walls were moving, suggested that LSD had profound effects on human consciousness at extraordinarily small doses. The medical possibilities seemed enormous, at least in 1940s terms, before anyone had really thought too hard about what enormous medical possibilities might look like in practice. Sandoz began producing LSD under the trade name Delicid and distributing it, free of charge, to researchers and psychiatrists around the world. The accompanying literature was straightforward to the point of being almost casual. Delicid was suggested for two primary uses. First, as a tool for therapists who wanted to experience temporarily something resembling the mental states of their psychotic patients, thereby developing greater empathy and understanding. And second, as a way of loosening psychological defences in patients undergoing psychotherapy, allowing repressed material to surface more readily. The recommended dose was printed on the package. It was, by later standards, almost charmingly optimistic, like handing someone a flamethrower and including a pamphlet about responsible use. Throughout the late 1940s and the entire 1950s, LSD flowed out of Sandoz's Basel headquarters and into research institutions across Europe and North America. Psychiatrists in Britain, Canada, the United States and Czechoslovakia were running studies. Hospitals were reporting remarkable results, particularly in the treatment of alcoholism, where a series of Canadian studies led by Humphrey Osmond suggested that a single high-dose LSD experience could produce lasting sobriety in patients who had failed every other treatment. The results were compelling enough that Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, became a vocal advocate for LSD-assisted therapy. This fact is not widely advertised at AA meetings. The problem, and there was always going to be a problem, was that LSD was not a compound that behaved predictably across different people and different settings. The same dose that produced a serene and therapeutic opening for one patient could produce a terrifying and destabilizing experience for another. The set and setting mattered enormously, a phrase that had not yet been coined but was already being demonstrated in real time across laboratories and hospital wards. Sandoz had sent an extraordinarily powerful tool into the world with relatively gentle instructions, and the assumption that the people receiving it were professionals who would use it carefully. Some of them were the CIA. The distinction, in terms of what happened next, was significant. Sandoz had created a pharmaceutical product. What they had actually released into the world was something considerably harder to categorize, a substance that was simultaneously a research tool, a psychiatric medicine, a weapon, a spiritual catalyst, and a social grenade, depending entirely on who was holding it and what they believed they were doing. The company continued producing Delicid until 1965, by which point events had moved so far beyond anything they had imagined in that Basel laboratory that there was no longer any meaningful way to describe LSD as a controlled pharmaceutical product. It had become something else entirely. It had become a symbol. Before anyone called LSD a party drug, a spiritual tool, or a government weapon, psychiatrists called it something far less glamorous, a psychotomimetic. That is a real word, and it means a substance that mimics psychosis. The thinking in the late 1940s and early 1950s went something like this. If doctors could temporarily experience something resembling schizophrenia by taking LSD, they might better understand their patients. It was, in the language of the era, a window into madness, a controlled, reversible one. Researchers across Europe and North America began experimenting with it clinically, administering it to volunteers, patients, and occasionally themselves, and writing up their findings with the cautious excitement of people who sensed they were touching something genuinely new. The early clinical literature on LSD makes for fascinating reading, partly because of how seriously and carefully it was written, and partly because of how utterly unprepared the authors were for where their research was heading. Psychiatrists described in meticulous clinical language the dissolution of ego boundaries, the intensification of sensory experience, the emergence of childhood memories with unusual emotional force, and the occasional complete restructuring of a patient's relationship with their own sense of self. These were not the observations of people trying to have a good time. These were clinicians with clipboards sitting in hospital rooms, watching their patients travel somewhere and trying to write down useful directions for the return journey. Humphrey Osmond, a British psychiatrist working in Saskatchewan, Canada, was among the most serious and consequential early researchers. Osmond's work with alcoholic patients produced some of the most striking results in the early literature, rates of sobriety following LSD therapy, that significantly exceeded what conventional treatment was achieving. He was also the man who, in correspondence with Aldous Huxley, coined the word psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting, because he felt that psychotomimetic was both inaccurate and unfairly prejudiced against the experience. The word entered the language in 1957 and never left. In Czechoslovakia, a researcher named Stanislav Grof was running some of the most extensive and carefully documented LSD therapy sessions in the world, eventually accumulating thousands of case studies and developing a comprehensive theoretical framework for what was happening in the psychedelic state. Grof's work, systematic, rigorous, deeply humanistic, would later become foundational to the psychedelic therapy renaissance of the early 21st century. He was working on it in Prague in the 1960s, while simultaneously on the other side of the world people were dropping acid at rock concerts, and the American government was trying to figure out whether it could use the same substance to disorient the enemy. The gap between the psychiatric research and the cultural explosion that followed is one of the stranger fault lines in the history of LSD. The researchers were asking careful questions about consciousness, trauma, and healing. What they found kept escaping the laboratory. It turned out that a substance powerful enough to temporarily dissolve a person's sense of self was not something that stayed neatly within the boundaries of clinical research. People had the experiences, went home, told their friends, and came back changed in ways that the discharge paperwork did not quite have the vocabulary to describe. Somewhere between the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, the American intelligence community developed what can only be described as a very specific type of anxiety. The Soviet Union, it was feared, had developed techniques for controlling the human mind, brainwashing, behavior modification, methods that could turn a loyal soldier into a puppet with the right combination of chemicals, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure. Whether this was entirely true is debatable. What is not debatable is what the CIA decided to do about it. They decided to get there first. The seeds of what would become MKUltra were planted in the late 1940s under programs called Project Artichoke and Project Bluebird, both of which were exploring the same basic question. Could the human mind be controlled, erased, or reprogrammed? The tools under investigation included hypnosis, electroconvulsive therapy, sensory deprivation, and a growing list of pharmaceutical compounds. When reports of LSD began circulating in the early 1950s, a substance so potent that an invisibly small amount could produce hours of complete psychological disorientation in a healthy adult, the CIA's interest was immediate and intense. The logic from the agency's perspective was not entirely unreasonable given the context. This was the era of Korean War POWs appearing at press conferences making statements that seemed inconsistent with their known values and beliefs. The word brainwashing had entered the American vocabulary and was producing genuine institutional panic. If the Soviets had a drug that could do this, or if such a drug existed and the Soviets got to it first, the consequences were unthinkable. The CIA did not want to be second. In 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles formally authorized MKUltra, a program that would eventually encompass more than 150 separate sub-projects, involve dozens of universities and research institutions, and spend the equivalent of hundreds of millions of modern dollars investigating methods of psychological manipulation. LSD was one of the program's primary interests. The agency's Technical Services Division, led by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, obtained large quantities of LSD from Sandoz and began an aggressive testing program. What they found, to their significant frustration, was that LSD was essentially useless as a mind control agent. It did not produce compliant, programmable subjects. It produced confused, terrified, ecstatic, weeping, occasionally laughing, and entirely unpredictable human beings who could not be relied upon to do anything useful at all. The variable nature of the experience, so heavily dependent on the mindset of the subject and the conditions of administration, made it nearly impossible to weaponize in any controlled or consistent way. The CIA had spent serious resources chasing a tool that turned out not to be a tool at all in any conventional sense. They kept trying anyway, for years, with a persistence that said less about the scientific evidence and more about the institutional momentum of a program that had developed its own internal gravity. Of all the things the CIA did during the years it was secretly experimenting with LSD on unwitting subjects, the case of Frank Olson is the one that history has never quite been able to put down. Olson was a biochemist working for the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. A serious, well-regarded scientist with a wife, 3 children, and a security clearance that meant he knew things most people did not. In November of 1953, he attended a working retreat at a lodge in rural Maryland with colleagues from the CIA. 2 days later, he was back home, but something was different. Frank Olson was not the same man who had left. At the retreat, Sidney Gottlieb had secretly dosed the drinks of several attendees with LSD without telling anyone beforehand. This was, even by the standards of MKUltra, a significant act of recklessness. The subjects had no preparation, no context, no one guiding the experience. They simply found themselves, mid-conversation, mid-dinner, suddenly inside something for which nothing in their lives had prepared them. For most of the attendees, the experience was disorienting but ultimately manageable. For Frank Olson, something went differently. Olson returned home agitated, withdrawn, and deeply troubled. He told his wife he'd made a terrible mistake. He spoke about wanting to leave government work entirely. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. He was taken to New York to see a psychiatrist, and arrangements were made for him to check into a psychiatric facility. On the morning of November 28, 1953, 9 days after the retreat, Frank Olson fell from the window of his room on the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City. He was declared dead on arrival. The official ruling was suicide. His family was told he had jumped. They were not told about the LSD. They were not told about MKUltra. They were given a cover story and left to grieve a man they did not entirely recognize as having been suicidal. It was not until 1975 when a congressional investigation into CIA activities forced the declassification of documents related to MKUltra that the Olson family learned what had actually happened at that retreat in Maryland. Frank Olson's son Eric spent decades afterward pursuing the full truth of his father's death, including, in 1994, having his father's body exhumed for a new forensic examination, which found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull inconsistent with a fall. The question of whether Frank Olson jumped, fell, or was pushed has never been definitively answered. What is not in question is that he was secretly dosed with LSD without his knowledge or consent, and that 9 days later he was dead. The CIA sent his widow a check. It did not include an apology. If you have ever been handed a drink at a party and thought, "I hope no one put anything in this," congratulations, you have instinctively understood the concern that should have stopped the Central Intelligence Agency dead in its tracks in the early 1950s. It did not stop them. Under the umbrella of MKUltra, a program officially approved in 1953 by CIA Director Allen Dulles, agency operatives began administering LSD to people who had absolutely no idea it was happening. The targets were varied, the methods were creative, and the ethical framework was essentially non-existent. The unwitting dosing program targeted people who, in the agency's calculation, were unlikely or unable to complain. Prisoners were dosed. Patients in psychiatric hospitals were dosed, sometimes without the knowledge of the institutions housing them. People in halfway houses were dosed. Sex workers were dosed. In one particularly dark chapter, patients at a federally funded addiction research center in Lexington, Kentucky, were given LSD repeatedly, sometimes daily for extended periods, in exchange for the heroin their bodies depended on. The people running these experiments were not cartoon villains. They were in many cases educated, credentialed professionals who had convinced themselves that the importance of the research justified the methods. The dosing was not limited to vulnerable populations. Agency employees were dosed without their knowledge at social gatherings and work functions. The internal logic was that the program needed to understand how LSD would affect unsuspecting subjects in real-world conditions, and you could not simulate that with willing volunteers who knew what was coming. This reasoning, while internally coherent from a certain intelligence perspective, produced situations of genuine cruelty. People in the middle of ordinary evenings suddenly experiencing hours of profound psychological distortion, with no support, no preparation, and no idea what was happening to them. The program continued in various forms for over a decade. The documents that would have provided a complete accounting of what had been done were ordered destroyed by CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973, 2 years before congressional investigators began looking for them. What survived was fragmentary, enough to reveal the outlines of the program but not enough to answer every question. The Church Committee hearings of 1975 brought the surviving information into public view. The country was shocked. The CIA expressed what might be described as institutional regret. Several of the people most responsible for designing and running the program were never prosecuted. The subjects who had been dosed, those who could be identified, were largely never compensated. The legacy of MKUltra's unwitting dosing program sits in a peculiar place in American history. It is simultaneously too well documented to deny and too disturbing to fully absorb. The government of the United States secretly dosed its own citizens with a powerful hallucinogen to see what would happen. The things that happened were sometimes terrible. Nobody who made that decision was ever held fully accountable. And if you think that sounds like the setup to a conspiracy theory, it is worth remembering that it is not a theory. It is a documented fact. It is just a fact that is still somewhat difficult to believe. Of all the MKUltra sub-projects, and there were over 150 of them, Operation Midnight Climax has a name that sounds invented, and a reality that is somehow even more extraordinary than the name suggests. Beginning in the mid-1950s, a CIA operative named George White, working under the supervision of the agency's Technical Services Division, set up a series of apartments in San Francisco and later New York that were decorated to look like ordinary flats, but were in fact surveillance installations. The premise, stated plainly, was this: hire sex workers to bring unsuspecting men back to the apartment, secretly dose them with LSD, and observe what happened while CIA personnel watched from behind a two-way mirror. The apartments were decorated with what George White apparently considered standard seduction decor. Photographs of French can-can dancers, collections of Toulouse-Lautrec prints, and a fully stocked bar. The bar was, of course, the delivery mechanism. Drinks were spiked. Subjects arrived expecting an ordinary evening and received instead several hours of profound pharmaceutical alteration, observed by federal employees who were taking notes and, by some accounts, drinking martinis on their side of the mirror. The stated purpose was to study LSD's potential as a tool for extracting information from unwitting subjects. What was actually being studied in practice was how confused and frightened people could become when dosed without warning in an unfamiliar environment. The answer, it turned out, was very. George White was not a subtle man. His own journal entries, which survived the document purge and were later obtained by journalists, described his participation in MKUltra with an enthusiasm that suggested he had found his calling. He wrote about the work with what can only be described as relish, the excitement of a man who had been given official permission to conduct experiments that the rest of society would not have approved. He noted in one entry that he had spent his career as a government agent breaking every law he could, and had enjoyed it immensely. This is perhaps not the mindset one hopes to find in the person running a federally funded psychological research program. The San Francisco operation ran for approximately a decade. Its subjects, the men who were dosed, observed, and sent home with no idea what had happened to them, were never identified, never notified, and never compensated. Some of them may have spent years wondering why one particular evening had felt so profoundly strange. Some of them may have had experiences during those hours that changed their understanding of their own minds. None of them consented to any of it. The safe houses were eventually shut down when MKUltra's funding dried up. The furniture was sold. The two-way mirrors came down. George White retired to Oregon, where he reportedly remained proud of his government service until his death. The whole episode reads like fiction, and was not. Before LSD had a counterculture, it had a philosopher, and that philosopher, perhaps somewhat unexpectedly, was a tall, half-blind British novelist who had already spent decades being one of the most articulate people alive about the relationship between consciousness, society, and the question of what human beings are actually capable of experiencing. Aldous Huxley had written Brave New World in 1932, imagining a future society controlled in part through a happiness drug called soma. By 1953, he was in Los Angeles taking mescaline under the supervision of a psychiatrist and writing down everything that happened. The resulting short book, The Doors of Perception, published in 1954, would become one of the most influential documents in the history of psychedelic culture. Huxley's central argument was elegant and, to the people who read it in the right state of mind, electrifying. He proposed that the human brain functions in ordinary waking life as a reducing valve, filtering out the vast majority of the information available to consciousness and allowing through only what is useful for biological survival. Psychedelics, Huxley argued, temporarily reduced the efficiency of this filter, allowing more of reality to get through. What felt like a hallucination was, from this perspective, not the addition of something false, but the removal of something that was ordinarily preventing you from seeing clearly. The implications of this idea, once it entered circulation, were considerable. Huxley was careful, measured, and deeply literary in his approach. He was not suggesting that everyone should take psychedelics, or that ordinary life was worthless. He was making a philosophical argument about the nature of perception and the possibility that consensus reality was a much narrower slice of what was actually available than most people assumed. He grounded the argument in references to William Blake, to Meister Eckhart, to Zen Buddhism, to the mystical traditions of multiple cultures that had independently arrived at descriptions of experience that sounded remarkably similar to what Huxley had felt in his living room in Los Angeles on a spring afternoon in 1953. The Doors of Perception gave the psychedelic experience an intellectual vocabulary at a moment when it needed one badly. It provided a framework that allowed serious people to engage with these substances without feeling that they were simply talking about getting high. When Timothy Leary read it, he recognised immediately that Huxley had done something important. He had made the conversation respectable, and when the musicians of the 1960s named their bands after William Blake quotations that Huxley had made famous, and when a generation of young people read Huxley's thin book and felt that someone had finally described an experience they had not known how to talk about, the chain of influence became one of the cleaner through lines in the cultural history of the 20th century. If Albert Hofmann was the accidental father of LSD and the CIA was its most paranoid early adopter, then Timothy Leary was its most enthusiastic and least governable publicist. Leary arrived at Harvard University in 1959 as a clinical psychologist with a legitimate academic reputation, and what can only be described as a talent for making everything around him significantly more complicated. He had done serious research in personality psychology. He had published in respected journals, and he was, by all accounts, genuinely brilliant. He was also deeply bored with conventional academic life, personally chaotic in ways that kept creating administrative problems, and about to have an experience in Mexico in the summer of 1960 that would redirect the rest of his life entirely. Leary travelled to Cuernavaca that summer with colleagues from Harvard and, after some negotiation, tried psilocybin mushrooms for the first time in the company of a local guide. What happened to him in those hours he would describe for the rest of his life as the most profound experience he had ever had, more significant, he said, than everything he had learned in his years of academic training. He came back to Harvard a changed man, which is a phrase that gets applied to people returning from various experiences and usually means relatively little. In Leary's case, it meant something specific and measurable. He had decided that psychedelics were the most important discovery in the history of psychology, that the academic study of them was his life's work, and that the existing institutional frameworks for that study were entirely inadequate to the task. The Harvard Psilocybin Project, which Leary launched with his colleague Richard Alpert in 1960, began with enough procedural respectability to satisfy a university review committee. Subjects were screened. Dosing was supervised. Notes were taken. The early results were striking. Participants described the sessions as among the most meaningful experiences of their lives, reporting lasting positive changes in mood, behavior, and self-understanding. The problem, which became apparent with increasing speed, was that the boundary between researcher and subject was dissolving. Leary was not merely studying psychedelics from a clinical distance. He was taking them constantly, along with his colleagues, his graduate students, and an expanding circle of artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals who were finding their way to the house in Newton where sessions were being held. Harvard watched this with mounting alarm. The university's concerns were not entirely unreasonable. The research protocols were loosening. The participant pool was expanding in ways that bore no relationship to any RB approval, and the principal investigator was beginning to sound less like a clinical psychologist and more like a prophet. Leary, for his part, had concluded that the university could not contain what he was doing, and that trying to make it fit the existing framework was a category error of the first order. He was right that something extraordinary was happening. He was considerably less right about his ability to manage the consequences. When Timothy Leary returned from Mexico in the summer of 1960, his mind was made up. He wanted to study psychedelic substances seriously, academically, with the full weight of Harvard behind him. His colleague Richard Alpert, who would later become famous under a very different name, was equally enthusiastic. Together, they launched what became known as the Harvard Psilocybin Project, beginning with psilocybin mushrooms rather than LSD, since psilocybin had been recently synthesized by Sandoz and was legally available to researchers. The project started with the kind of careful methodology that makes institutional review boards comfortable, and then gradually became the kind of project that makes institutional review boards call emergency meetings. One of the project's most ambitious offshoots was the Concord Prison Experiment, launched in 1961. The premise was straightforward, at least on paper. If psilocybin could produce profound experiences of self-reflection and personal transformation in healthy volunteers, could it do the same for convicted criminals? Could a single psychedelic session reduce the likelihood that a prisoner would reoffend after release? Leary and his colleagues brought psilocybin into the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Concord and administered it to a group of inmates in a supervised, supportive setting. The sessions were conducted not in the clinical cold of a hospital room but in a human environment. Participants sat together, talked, listened to music, and were encouraged to explore whatever arose. The results, as reported at the time, were remarkable. Inmates described the sessions as transformative. Several spoke about seeing their own lives with a clarity they had never experienced before, understanding for the first time the patterns that had led them to where they were. The preliminary recidivism data suggested that participants were reoffending at significantly lower rates than the general prison population. Leary was energized. This, he believed, was proof that psychedelics were not merely interesting, but urgently, practically important. He wrote about the Concord results with the excitement of a man who believed he had found a solution to a problem that society had been failing to solve for centuries. The follow-up studies, conducted decades later by a researcher named Rick Doblin, were considerably more sobering. When Doblin reanalyzed the original data in the 1990s, he found that the recidivism rates for the Concord participants were not, in fact, significantly different from the control group over the long term. The original analysis had been methodologically flawed, optimistic perhaps, in ways that reflected Leary's investment in the outcome rather than a dispassionate reading of the numbers. This is a pattern that would recur throughout the history of psychedelic research, where the intensity and meaningfulness of the experiences made it genuinely difficult for researchers to maintain the distance that good science requires. None of which means the Concord Prison Experiment was worthless. The participants' own accounts of what they experienced during the sessions were consistent and compelling. Something real was happening in those rooms. The question of whether what happened in the sessions translated into lasting behavioural change in the conditions of actual life, poverty, addiction, lack of support, re-entry into the same environments that had produced the original problems, was a much harder question, and one that psilocybin alone was never going to answer. Leary, characteristically, was not particularly interested in the harder question. He was interested in the vision. The vision was genuine. The methodology, less so. By the time the full limitations of the Concord data became apparent, Leary had long since moved on to larger ambitions. He had found LSD. He had met Aldous Huxley. He had begun to develop the philosophical framework that would make him the most famous and most controversial advocate for psychedelics in American history. The prison experiment was a chapter, not a conclusion. And like most chapters in Leary's life, it ended before anyone had fully figured out what it meant. On Good Friday, 1962, in Marsh Chapel at Boston University, a graduate student named Walter Pankey administered psilocybin to 10 divinity students and a placebo to 10 others, then had all 20 of them sit through a 2.5-hour religious service. This was his doctoral dissertation. The experiment, later known as the Marsh Chapel experiment or the Good Friday experiment, was attempting to answer one of the stranger empirical questions in the history of psychology. Can a psychedelic substance reliably produce a genuine mystical experience? The divinity students who received the active substance would later describe what happened as among the most profound experiences of their lives. Several of them went on to become ministers specifically because of what they felt in that chapel on that Friday morning. The double-blind design was as rigorous as circumstances allowed. Neither the participants nor the guides administering the capsules knew in advance who had received the active dose. The service proceeded as normal. Organ music, prayers, scripture readings, the full architecture of a traditional Good Friday observance. For the students who had received the placebo, it was a meaningful religious service. For the students who had received psilocybin, it became something considerably harder to categorize. Several reported experiences of profound unity with the universe, a dissolution of the ordinary boundaries between self and world, an overwhelming sense of sacredness and love that felt more real, not less, than ordinary waking consciousness. One participant had to be quietly escorted outside when the intensity of the experience became difficult to contain within the pew. Pankey's results were striking. 8 of the 10 active dose participants reported mystical experiences meeting his predefined criteria. One of the placebo participants reported something similar, suggesting that the chapel setting itself was not without effect. The findings fed directly into a growing academic argument about the nature of religious experience, whether mystical states were a specific neurological phenomenon that could be reliably induced, or whether they required the kind of authentic spiritual preparation and context that a graduate student's dissertation protocol could not replicate. The long-term follow-up conducted by Rick Doblin 25 years later added a dimension that Pankey had not lived to document. He died in a scuba diving accident in 1971. Doblin tracked down the original participants and interviewed them about the lasting effects of their Good Friday experience. The results were consistent and, by the standards of psychological research, unusual. The participants who had received psilocybin still described the Marsh Chapel experience as one of the most significant of their lives a quarter-century later. Several described it as having permanently deepened their faith, their sense of vocation, and their capacity for compassion. One participant described how, in the years that followed, he had returned to the memory of that morning repeatedly during difficult periods in his life, as a source of stability, of perspective, of something that felt like bedrock. The Good Friday experiment did not resolve the philosophical debate about the nature of mystical experience. It simply made the debate much harder to dismiss. When serious researchers at credentialed institutions found that psilocybin could reliably produce experiences that met every criterion for mystical states, and that those experiences had measurable, lasting effects on the people who had them, the question was no longer whether something real was happening. The question was what, exactly, that something was. It is a question that researchers, theologians, and neuroscientists are still arguing about today, in seminar rooms and journals, occasionally glancing back at a chapel in Boston where, on one Good Friday morning, 20 young men sat down for a service and half of them never quite came back the same. Harvard University, to absolutely no one's long-term surprise, eventually ran out of patience with Timothy Leary. The final dismissal came in 1963, and it arrived not because of the psychedelic research itself, though that was certainly a contributing atmosphere, but officially because Leary had been repeatedly failing to show up to teach his classes. Richard Alpert was fired at the same time for giving psilocybin to an undergraduate student, which crossed a line that Harvard, despite everything, was not prepared to let go. The firings made national news, and here is the part that the university presumably did not fully anticipate. Being fired from Harvard for drug research in 1963 was, for the counterculture that was already beginning to form around the edges of American life, roughly equivalent to being expelled from a very boring club by people who didn't understand what was happening. Leary processed the firing with characteristic speed and reframing. Within weeks he had concluded that being dismissed from the most prestigious university in America was not a setback but a liberation. He no longer had to pretend that the existing institutional framework was adequate for what he was trying to do. He could say now what he actually thought, without the moderating influence of tenure committees and department heads. What he actually thought, expressed with increasing directness over the following years, was that LSD was the most important discovery in human history, that consciousness expansion was both a personal right and a civilizational imperative, and that the people standing in the way of this understanding were, in various combinations, frightened, small-minded, and operating from an investment in a reality that was considerably less interesting than the one available. He and Alpert found a patron in the form of William Mellon Hitchcock, the heir to a considerable fortune, who offered them the use of a large estate in Millbrook, New York. The Millbrook estate became the headquarters of an ongoing experiment in communal psychedelic living, part research centre, part philosophical commune, part open house for an expanding cast of artists, musicians, writers, and seekers who arrived from across the country to participate in what Leary was calling the psychedelic revolution. The gate at Millbrook was open, more or less, and the resulting community was everything you would expect from an arrangement in which a charismatic former Harvard professor, with unlimited LSD and a 64-room mansion, invited the world to come and expand its consciousness. Leary's message post-Harvard became both simpler and more radical. The phrase he became most associated with, turn on, tune in, drop out, was coined in 1966 and summarized his position with a compression that was either brilliant or reckless, depending on your perspective. Turn on meant activate your neural and genetic equipment through the use of psychedelics. Tune in meant interact harmoniously with the world around you. Drop out meant detach yourself from the involuntary commitments imposed by conventional society. The phrase was picked up by the media, repeated endlessly, stripped of most of its nuance, and used as evidence that Leary was encouraging young people to abandon their responsibilities, which, to be fair, was not entirely wrong. But it was also not the whole story. The whole story was considerably stranger and more interesting, as the whole story usually is. While Timothy Leary was building his psychedelic philosophy from the top down, Harvard, mysticism, the vocabulary of Eastern religion and Western psychology, another very different figure was arriving at LSD from the bottom up, through literature, through buses, and through a fundamental belief that the most important thing about psychedelics was not what they meant, but what they felt like, and that everyone should find out. Ken Kesey had first taken LSD not at a party or a protest, but as a paid volunteer in a government-sponsored research study at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Menlo Park, California in 1959. He found the experience so significant that he smuggled some of the drugs out of the hospital and began sharing them with friends. Kesey was, by the early 1960s, already the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a novel written partly while he was on psilocybin and working night shifts in a psychiatric ward. He was living in La Honda, California, in a property that had become the gathering place for a loose group of friends and fellow travellers who would eventually call themselves the Merry Pranksters. The pranksters were not philosophers or academics. They were, for the most part, people who found the ordinary world too slow and too small, and who had discovered that LSD made it considerably larger and faster, at least for a while. What they wanted to do with that discovery was share it, loudly, with as many people as possible, without asking anyone's permission. In the summer of 1964, the pranksters loaded 1949 International Harvester school bus, painted in day-glow colours, equipped with speakers and cameras, bearing the destination sign further on the front, and drove it from California to New York, documenting everything, broadcasting their presence, and taking LSD continuously across the continental United States. The driver for significant stretches of the journey was Neil Cassidy, the same man who had driven Jack Kerouac across the country a decade earlier and inspired On the Road. The trip produced hours-long film that Kesey and the pranksters spent years trying to edit into something coherent and never quite managed, which was perhaps appropriate given the circumstances of its creation. Back in California, the pranksters began hosting events they called acid tests, gatherings where LSD was available in the punch. The Grateful Dead played music that seemed to have been designed specifically for the inside of a dissolving mind, and several hundred people simultaneously explored the outer limits of their own consciousness in an atmosphere of deliberate chaos, fluorescent paint, and projected films. The acid tests were the first large-scale public LSD events in American history, and they established a template: music, crowds, altered states, the suspension of ordinary social rules that would echo through decades of festival culture. They were also, by any reasonable measure, completely illegal, which the pranksters regarded as one of their more interesting features. Leary and Kesey met, recognised each other as operating on parallel frequencies, and found that they disagreed about almost everything except the fundamental importance of what they were doing. Leary wanted consciousness expansion to be guided, intentional, and philosophically grounded. Kesey wanted it to be unplanned, collective, and loud. History, in the end, found room for both of them. It would be difficult to overstate how completely LSD reshaped American popular music in the middle of the 1960s, but the attempt must be made because the transformation was genuinely that thorough. Before LSD entered the culture, rock and roll was largely a music of 3 chords, 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and themes that revolved around cars, dancing, and romantic longing. After LSD entered the culture, rock and roll became a music of 8-minute guitar solos, backward vocals, orchestral arrangements, lyrics about tangerine trees and marmalade skies, and an implicit invitation to the listener to consider the possibility that ordinary reality was one among many. The Grateful Dead were the house band at Ken Kesey's acid tests, and the music they developed in that environment bore the unmistakable imprint of those origins. Their songs were long, open, structured around improvisation rather than repetition, and designed, consciously, explicitly, to mirror the architecture of a psychedelic experience. A Grateful Dead concert did not have a set list in any conventional sense. It had a trajectory, a series of departures and returns, peaks and valleys, moments of chaos that resolved into moments of unexpected beauty. Audience members who were not on LSD frequently reported feeling as though they were. This was either a testament to the band's musicianship or an indication of something stranger about the relationship between certain kinds of sound and certain states of consciousness, probably both. The Beatles, operating from a different continent and a different starting point, arrived at the same territory through a combination of their own experimentation and the influence of the Indian musical tradition, which George Harrison had begun exploring after his introduction to LSD. The shift between the early Beatles, polished, melodic, firmly rooted in the conventions of popular music, and the middle and late Beatles is one of the most dramatic in the history of recorded sound. Revolver, released in 1966, contained songs that had no precedent in popular music. Tomorrow Never Knows, built on a drone and filled with backward tape loops and Leary-influenced imagery, drawn directly from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a year later, was a fully realised psychedelic artefact, a record that worked, on one level, as a collection of songs and on another level, as a sustained attempt to recreate in sound what LSD recreated in consciousness. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, Pink Floyd, the list of artists whose work was shaped by psychedelic experience is long enough to constitute, essentially, the entire canon of late 1960s rock music. The question of who was on LSD and who was not is almost beside the point, because even the artists who were not personally using psychedelics were making music for audiences who were, and adjusting their sound accordingly. The culture had changed the frequency. The music followed, or sometimes led, and the two things moved together through the second half of the decade in a way that made it genuinely impossible to say where the drugs ended and the art began. In the summer of 1967, somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 young people converged on the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco, and the resulting few months of communal living, outdoor concerts, free food, political poetry, and enormous quantities of LSD became known as the Summer of Love. The name was partly aspirational and partly descriptive. There was, by all accounts, a great deal of goodwill circulating through those streets, but it was also, like most things named in the moment they are happening, somewhat more complicated on closer inspection than it appeared from the outside. The Haight-Ashbury neighbourhood had been building toward this moment for several years, developing a distinct culture of communal living, alternative economics, and psychedelic experimentation that drew young people from across the country. The Diggers, a group of anarchist street performers and activists, were running free food kitchens and establishing free stores where everything was available at no cost. The Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane were playing in the park. Bands like Big Brother and the Holding Company, featuring a young singer named Janis Joplin, were developing a sound in the small clubs of the district that would shortly make them famous. LSD was everywhere, available on the street, dropped into the water at parties, pressed into colourful tablets with names that read like a particularly creative children's menu. The event that announced the Summer of Love to the broader world was the Human Be-In, held in Golden Gate Park in January of that year. 20,000 people gathered to listen to music, hear speeches from Leary and other countercultural figures, and participate in what the organisers described as a gathering of the tribes. It was the first large-scale public expression of the new consciousness, a demonstration that what had been developing in Haight-Ashbury was not a local eccentricity, but something with the potential to become a mass movement. The media arrived, photographed the flowers and the face paint, broadcast the images nationally, and inadvertently produced the largest advertisement in the history of the counterculture. By June, the hate was overwhelmed. Young people who had seen the television coverage arrived by the thousands with no money, no housing, and no particular plan beyond the conviction that something important was happening and they needed to be part of it. The infrastructure of the neighbourhood, the free kitchens, the crash pads, the informal systems of mutual aid buckled under the weight of the influx. Drug overdoses increased. Predatory figures arrived alongside the idealistic ones. By the end of the summer, many of the people who had built the Haight-Ashbury community were quietly leaving it, exhausted by what the publicity had done to the thing they had created. The diggers held a mock funeral in October, carrying a coffin through the streets in a ceremony they called the Death of the Hippie. The summer of love was over. What it had started was not. The United States government, watching the 1960s unfold, was not enjoying itself. From the perspective of federal authorities, an alarming sequence of events was occurring. A substance that had originated in a Swiss laboratory, been picked up by the CIA for weapons research, and then somehow escaped into the general population was now being celebrated as a tool of liberation by a generation of young people who were also, not coincidentally, vocally opposed to the Vietnam War, skeptical of institutional authority, and resistant to being drafted. The response was to make LSD illegal, which happened at the federal level in 1968, and the speed of the criminalization said a great deal about how frightened the establishment had become. The legislative process that produced LSD's prohibition moved with unusual velocity for a government that was not, in general, known for moving quickly on anything. California had already criminalized LSD in 1966, partly in response to the acid tests and the growing visibility of the Haight-Ashbury scene. Other states followed. The federal prohibition came through the Drug Abuse Control Amendments of 1965 and the escalating legislative responses that followed, culminating in the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which established the scheduling system still in use today. Under that system, LSD was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, alongside heroin and ahead of cocaine and methamphetamine, which were placed in Schedule 2 on the grounds that they had accepted medical uses. The scientific community protested with limited effect. Researchers who had spent years accumulating evidence of LSD's therapeutic potential submitted testimony to the effect that placing the substance in Schedule 1 would make further research essentially impossible, which, given that Schedule 1 classification required researchers to obtain special licenses, house the drug in approved facilities, and navigate layers of bureaucratic oversight that did not apply to other controlled substances, was an accurate prediction. Congress was not primarily interested in the scientific testimony. Congress was interested in the photographs of young people at Woodstock and the reports of bad trips and the general sense that something had gotten out of control and needed to be shut down. The prohibition produced several immediate effects, most of them contrary to its stated intentions. LSD did not disappear. It went underground, where it was produced by clandestine chemists who, freed from the constraints of pharmaceutical manufacturing, were under no obligation to maintain consistent purity or dosage. The quality of underground LSD was variable in ways that produced exactly the kind of bad outcomes the government was ostensibly trying to prevent. The research stopped. The therapeutic applications that had been showing genuine promise, the alcoholism treatment, the end-of-life anxiety work, the psychiatric applications, were buried under the scheduling designation and did not resurface for 30 years. The counterculture did not disband. It simply became more suspicious of the government, which, given what MKUltra had involved, was not an entirely unreasonable position. The summer of love had barely ended before its shadow arrived, and the shadow had a name and a desert compound, and a very specific approach to LSD that had nothing to do with liberation or mysticism or the expansion of human consciousness, and everything to do with control. Charles Manson arrived in Haight-Ashbury in 1967, the same summer, the same streets, the same culture. But what he took from it was not peace. Manson recognised, with a sociopath's precision, that LSD could be used not to open minds but to reshape them, particularly when combined with sleep deprivation, social isolation, and a charismatic man who positioned himself as a spiritual authority. Manson was 32 years old when he arrived in San Francisco, fresh from several years of federal imprisonment, and possessed of an unusual understanding of how to make people need him. He moved through the counterculture like a man shopping for raw material, identifying young people, mostly women, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, mostly estranged from their families, who were looking for meaning and community in the free-floating world of the hate. He offered both, wrapped in a syncretic philosophy assembled from Scientology, the Bible, Beatles lyrics, and his own developing theology about a coming race war he called Helter Skelter. LSD was central to the family's internal culture, but it was administered very differently than it was in the experimental sessions at Harvard or the communal gatherings at the acid tests. Manson used high doses, given in controlled settings, to dissolve the psychological boundaries of new members and replace their existing sense of self with one he had constructed. The experience of ego dissolution that psychedelic researchers described in carefully positive terms, the temporary dissolution of the ordinary sense of self as a potentially therapeutic or mystical event, became, in Manson's hands, a recruitment tool. People who had had profound and disorienting experiences under his supervision, in his environment, surrounded by his followers, were significantly more susceptible to his authority than they had been before. The murders committed by Manson family members in August of 1969, the Tate and LaBianca killings that sent a wave of horror through Los Angeles and eventually through the entire country, were carried out by people whose capacity for independent moral judgment had been systematically dismantled over months of LSD use, sleep deprivation, and Manson's relentless psychological conditioning. This is not to say that LSD caused the murders. It is to say that Manson understood something that the counterculture's more optimistic advocates had not fully reckoned with. A substance powerful enough to dissolve the self was powerful enough to be used against the person having the experience in the wrong hands under the wrong conditions. The summer of love and the Manson family murders were not opposites. They were two ends of the same set of possibilities, separated by the intentions of the people holding the drug. President Richard Nixon had many preoccupations, and in 1970, one of them was Timothy Leary. Nixon reportedly called Leary the most dangerous man in America, which is a remarkable designation for a former Harvard psychology professor whose primary activity was advocating that people take psychedelics and contemplate the nature of consciousness. Leary was, by this point, a convicted drug offender. He'd been arrested in 1965 crossing the Texas-Mexico border with marijuana belonging to his daughter, which he ultimately claimed as his own to protect her, and he had been sentenced to 30 years in prison, a sentence that was eventually reduced but still resulted in his imprisonment. Nixon's war on drugs, declared formally in 1971, was explicitly framed as a response to the social upheaval of the 1960s, the anti-war movement, the counterculture, the civil rights movement, the general sense that institutional authority had lost its grip on a generation. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, would admit decades later in a remarkable interview that the war on drugs had been designed with a specific political purpose that went well beyond public health. The two enemies of the Nixon administration, Ehrlichman said, were the anti-war left and black people. By associating the left with marijuana and black people with heroin, and by criminalizing both heavily, the administration could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, and raid their homes. Did they know they were lying about the drugs? Ehrlichman was asked. We knew, he said. This context matters for understanding what happened to LSD specifically. The criminalization of psychedelics was not primarily a response to a genuine public health emergency. It was a political project designed to associate the anti-war movement with criminality and to provide legal tools for the suppression of dissent. Leary was the perfect symbol for this purpose: photogenic, quotable, genuinely provocative, and now, conveniently, a convicted criminal. His 30-year sentence, handed down by a Texas judge for possession of a small amount of marijuana, was a demonstration of exactly how the system intended to treat the counterculture going forward. Nixon's FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had already been running COINTELPRO, a program of surveillance, infiltration, and deliberate disruption targeting civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, and the broader left. LSD figures, including Leary, were monitored, harassed, and subjected to the full toolkit of a security apparatus that regarded domestic dissent as an enemy combatant problem. The irony, which history has not failed to note, is that the government that was most aggressively criminalizing LSD was the same government that, a decade earlier, had been spending significant resources trying to use it as a weapon. The drug had not changed. The political context had. In September of 1970, Timothy Leary escaped from the California men's colony prison at San Luis Obispo with the help of the Weather Underground, a radical left-wing organization that had decided that breaking a psychedelic philosopher out of jail was both a politically symbolic act and a practical contribution to the counterculture. The escape itself was almost elegant. Leary climbed a telephone wire over the prison fence, slipped away into the dark, and was picked up by waiting accomplices. He was 50 years old. He fled the country with his wife Rosemary, eventually ending up in Algeria, where he was briefly harboured by the Black Panther Party in exile. A situation that became complicated almost immediately for reasons one could have anticipated in advance. The Algerian chapter of Leary's fugitive years is one of the stranger subplots in the entire history of the counterculture. Eldridge Cleaver, the Black Panther Minister of Information, who was running the party's Algerian operation, placed Leary under what amounted to house arrest within weeks of his arrival, declaring that Leary's advocacy for psychedelics was counter-revolutionary, that telling oppressed people to turn inward and explore their consciousness was a distraction from the political struggle, and that the Black Panther Party was not in the business of providing sanctuary to people whose primary contribution to the revolution was advising young white people to drop acid. Leary, who had not anticipated being detained by the people who had helped him escape, eventually fled Algeria for Switzerland, where he continued to give interviews, write, and maintain an extraordinary level of visibility for a fugitive. From Switzerland, Leary moved through various countries, Austria, Afghanistan, before being apprehended in Kabul in 1973 by agents of the Drug Enforcement Administration working in cooperation with local authorities. He was extradited back to the United States and returned to prison, where he was placed in a cell adjacent to Charles Manson at one point, a juxtaposition that history seems almost to have arranged deliberately as a comment on something. Leary, ever adaptable, cooperated with the FBI to some degree during this period, providing information about the Weather Underground contacts who had assisted his escape. This cooperation was later used by critics to paint him as an informant. His defenders argued that the information he provided was minimal, and that his survival instincts were understandable given the circumstances. The debate about Leary's character, visionary or charlatan, revolutionary or opportunist, prophet or con man, has never been fully resolved, which is perhaps the most accurate reflection of who he actually was. He was released from prison in 1976, continued writing and speaking and performing until his death in 1996, and remained to the end a figure who provoked strong reactions in everyone who encountered him. His legacy is complicated in the way that the legacies of people who are right about something important but wrong, about many of the specific details, tend to be complicated. The door he opened was real. The way he opened it was sometimes reckless. Both things are true simultaneously, which is uncomfortable, and which Leary himself would probably have found amusing. Here is a sentence that is both completely true and somehow still startling every time it is said. Several of the people most responsible for building the personal computer, the internet and the software culture that now runs most of the modern world either used LSD themselves or were directly influenced by people who did. Steve Jobs said that taking LSD was one of the 2 or 3 most important experiences of his life. Douglas Engelbart, who invented the computer mouse and the concept of hypertext, worked in an environment deeply shaped by psychedelic thinking. Stuart Brand, who published the Whole Earth Catalogue, a document Jobs called the precursor to the internet, was a merry prankster and an acid veteran. The connection between psychedelics and computing is not coincidental. It runs through a specific place, a specific time, and a specific set of ideas about what computers were for. In the early 1960s, the dominant model of computing was institutional. Massive mainframes housed in government facilities and university basements, operated by specialists, inaccessible to ordinary people. The counterculture, shaped in part by its psychedelic experiences, developed a radically different vision. The computer as a tool for individual liberation, a device that could expand human consciousness rather than consolidate institutional power. This vision, which sounds obvious now because it, one, was genuinely radical at the time, and it drew its energy from the same intellectual current that was producing communes, underground newspapers, and the acid tests. Stuart Brand articulated the connection most clearly. Brand had been at La Honda with the merry pranksters, had organised the human be-in, and had spent years moving through the overlapping worlds of psychedelics, ecology, and technology. In 1968, he organised an event called the Mother of All Demos, at which Douglas Engelbart demonstrated for the first time in public a computer system with a mouse, hypertext links, video conferencing, and collaborative real-time editing. The audience, which included many people with significant psychedelic experience, recognized immediately that what they were seeing was a technology that could do for the mind what LSD did, open it to new possibilities, dissolve the boundaries between individual and collective, create new ways of seeing. The connection was explicit and acknowledged. Steve Jobs, in multiple interviews across his career, described his LSD experiences as formative, not in the sense of having given him specific technical ideas, but in the sense of having permanently altered his understanding of what was possible and what mattered. He described the experience of taking LSD in his early 20s as one of the most important things he had ever done, and he expressed the view that people who had not had that kind of experience were missing something important about the nature of reality. Whether or not one agrees with that assessment, it is worth noting that the products Jobs created, the Macintosh, the iPod, the iPhone, were all distinguished by a quality of aesthetic coherence and intuitive design that their competitors consistently failed to replicate, and that Jobs consistently attributed to his willingness to think about what people actually experienced, rather than what engineers found technically elegant. The psychedelic influence on Silicon Valley is not a story about drugs making people smarter. It is a story about a particular set of experiences producing a particular set of values, a belief in the importance of subjective experience, a willingness to question inherited assumptions about what technology was for, a conviction that the boundary between the human and the digital was more fluid than the institutional computing culture had assumed. Those values built the devices you're probably using right now. The molecule that Albert Hofmann synthesized in a Basel laboratory in 1938 is, in a very real and traceable sense, present in the architecture of the modern world. That is either a remarkable fact or a deeply unsettling one, depending on how you feel about the 1960s. When LSD was made illegal in the United States in 1968, and then classified as a Schedule I controlled substance under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, meaning the government officially declared it had no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, the effect on scientific research was immediate and almost total. The hundreds of studies that had been conducted throughout the 1950s and 60s, exploring LSD's potential in the treatment of alcoholism, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and end-of-life distress in terminal patients, simply stopped. Researchers who had spent careers on psychedelic psychiatry found their funding gone, their institutional support vanished, and their field suddenly classified not as medicine, but as a social threat. The scale of what was lost is worth sitting with for a moment. By the time LSD was scheduled in 1970, there were over 1,000 published clinical papers documenting psychedelic research involving more than 40,000 patients. The body of literature was not peripheral or fringe. It included work from major universities, respected research hospitals, and credentialed psychiatrists operating well within the mainstream of their profession. Humphrey Osmond's alcoholism research had produced results that compared favourably with anything conventional treatment was achieving. Studies on end-of-life anxiety, administering LSD to patients with terminal cancer diagnoses to reduce fear and psychological suffering in their final months, had produced outcomes so consistently positive that researchers struggled to explain them within the existing theoretical frameworks of psychiatry. All of it stopped. Journals stopped accepting submissions on psychedelic research because the substances were now illegal and the institutional risk of association outweighed the scientific interest. Funding bodies stopped awarding grants. Universities stopped approving protocols. Researchers who had built their careers on this work quietly shifted their focus to other areas, or retired, or spent their remaining years watching the therapeutic potential they had documented gather dust under a scheduling classification that had been designed for political purposes rather than scientific ones. The patients who might have benefited, the alcoholics, the dying, the severely depressed, did not receive treatments that the evidence suggested could help them, because the government had decided that the political optics of psychedelic research were incompatible with the war on drugs narrative. The underground research that continued despite the prohibition, conducted quietly by a small number of therapists who continued administering psychedelics to patients off the books, in legal jeopardy, without institutional support, preserved some of the clinical knowledge that would otherwise have been completely lost. But it could not be published, could not be replicated, could not build toward the kind of evidence base that would eventually be needed to reopen the official conversation. The gap in the formal literature lasted approximately 30 years. What was rediscovered when researchers finally found their way back to the question in the early 2000s was in many respects exactly what had been found before, which made the 30-year interruption feel even more wasteful than it had at the time. LSD did not disappear when it was criminalized. It went underground, where it had a long and complicated career through the 1970s, 80s and 90s, showing up at concerts, in college dormitories, in the notebooks of writers and musicians who never quite announced what had influenced them, and eventually, in the late 1980s and early 90s, in the warehouse parties and open fields of the emerging rave scene. The rave era was primarily associated with MDMA, known as ecstasy, rather than LSD, but the two substances frequently coexisted in the same culture, the same events, and the same generation of young people who had grown up too late for Woodstock and were now building their own version of collective altered experience to entirely different music. The rave scene emerged in Britain in the late 1980s, drawing its energy from the convergence of several forces: electronic dance music arriving from Chicago and Detroit, MDMA spreading through the nightclub world, and a generation of young people for whom the politics of the 1960s were ancient history, but the desire for collective transcendence was completely current. Raves happened in fields, in warehouses, in disused factories, anywhere large enough to contain several thousand people, and far enough from residential areas that the bass frequencies would not generate police calls before dawn. The aesthetic was deliberately overwhelming. Strobing lights, fog machines, music at volumes designed to make the body vibrate, crowds large enough that individual identity dissolved into collective movement. For people who had taken MDMA or LSD or both, the experience had the quality of a religious ceremony conducted at 140 beats per minute. The British government's response to the rave scene reproduced almost exactly the American government's response to the counterculture 20 years earlier. The Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 specifically criminalised gatherings featuring music characterised by repetitive beats, a piece of legislation whose specificity still astonishes legal scholars, since it was essentially a law against a particular type of party. The effect on the rave scene was to drive it further underground, which made it simultaneously harder to police and harder to make safe, producing the same combination of outcomes that the American drug laws had produced in the 1970s. LSD itself experienced a resurgence during the 90s that drew from multiple directions simultaneously. The Grateful Dead were still touring, drawing audiences of hundreds of thousands of people annually to events where LSD was available and expected. The festival circuit, Glastonbury in Britain, various successors to the original Woodstock in America, provided regular gatherings where psychedelic use was normalised, and an underground distribution network, operating through mail order systems that preceded the internet and then adapted to it, kept LSD available to people who were looking for it in quantities and at purities that suggested serious clandestine manufacturing infrastructure. The molecule had gone dark. It had not gone away. In the early 2000s, something quietly remarkable began to happen in American psychiatry. Researchers who had spent decades navigating the bureaucratic aftermath of the war on drugs finally found narrow pathways back into legitimate psychedelic research, and what they found when they got there was both vindicating and humbling. The early results of new studies on psilocybin, LSD's gentler, shorter-acting cousin, at institutions like Johns Hopkins and New York University, suggested that the psychiatric researchers of the 1950s had been onto something real. A single, carefully guided session could produce lasting reductions in depression, anxiety, and addiction that conventional pharmaceuticals, after decades of development, had struggled to match. The researchers who navigated the regulatory pathway back to psychedelic research in the early 2000s did so with extraordinary care, in full awareness that one badly managed study could set the field back by years. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins, Matthew Johnson at the same institution, Stephen Ross at NYU. These were not counterculture figures. They were mainstream researchers with mainstream credentials, and they designed their studies with a methodological rigour that was partly scientific and partly political, because they understood that the field was operating under a level of scrutiny that conventional pharmaceutical research did not face. Every adverse event would be reported prominently. Every inconclusive result would be used as evidence that the research was misguided. They had essentially no margin for error. The results, when they came, were striking enough to generate serious attention, even in journals and institutions that had no interest in the cultural associations of psychedelics. A study on psilocybin-assisted therapy for smoking cessation produced abstinence rates that no existing treatment could match. A study on end-of-life anxiety in cancer patients found that a single psilocybin session produced lasting reductions in fear and depression that were maintained at 6-month follow-up. A study on treatment-resistant depression found rapid and substantial improvement in patients for whom years of conventional antidepressant treatment had produced no meaningful relief. The results were not perfect, and the researchers were careful not to oversell them. But they were good enough that the conversation began to change. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, known as MAPS, had been working since 1986 to navigate the regulatory pathway toward legal psychedelic therapy, focusing primarily on MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. The organization's founder, Rick Doblin, the same researcher who had reanalyzed the Concord prison data in the 1990s, had spent more than 3 decades building the evidentiary foundation for a regulatory approval process that most of the scientific establishment had initially regarded as a fantasy. By the early 2020s, MAPS was in Phase 3 clinical trials with the FDA, and the approval of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD was a genuine near-term possibility. The door that had been slammed shut in 1970 was opening again, slowly, through the most unglamorous means imaginable. Grant applications, IRB protocols, regulatory submissions, and what was waiting on the other side looked, in several respects, exactly like what the researchers of the 1950s had found before the door was closed. In 1938, Albert Hofmann synthesized a compound he didn't yet know how to think about and filed it away. In 1943, he accidentally absorbed a trace of it through his fingertips, bicycled home through a Swiss city that had briefly become something else entirely, and sat down to write up his notes. In the 80-odd years since, that molecule, smaller than a grain of salt, colourless, tasteless, and invisible in a glass of water, quietly moved through the 20th century, touching almost everything it encountered. Government policy, popular music, psychiatry, computer science, spiritual practice, criminal law, and the private interior lives of millions of people who never spoke publicly about what they had experienced, or what it had cost them, or what it had given them. The scale of LSD's cultural footprint is genuinely difficult to map. It is present in the music that defined the late 1960s as surely as any political event. It is present in the architecture of the devices most people carry in their pockets, through the chain of influence that runs from the merry pranksters to Stuart Brand to the personal computer revolution. It is present in the therapeutic frameworks that are now being cautiously reintroduced into psychiatry after a 30-year prohibition. It is present in the spiritual practices of millions of people who encountered something in the psychedelic state that their existing religious vocabulary was inadequate to describe, and who spent the subsequent years trying to find a framework that fit. It is present in the CIA's darkest chapters, in the files of MKUltra, in the case of Frank Olson, and the unwitting subjects of Operation Midnight Climax who never knew what had been done to them. What is remarkable about LSD's history is not merely that a single molecule had such wide-ranging effects, but that those effects were so consistently difficult to control or predict. Every institution that tried to manage LSD, Sandoz, the CIA, Harvard, the counterculture itself, the federal government, found that it escaped the framework that had been built to contain it. Sandoz sent it out as a psychiatric research tool, and watched it become a social movement. The CIA tried to use it as a weapon and found it was useless for that purpose, while inadvertently seeding the counterculture with the information that such a substance existed. Harvard tried to study it academically and found the boundary between researcher and subject dissolving under their feet. The government tried to criminalize it and found that prohibition made it more dangerous without making it less available. The lesson that LSD's history offers is not a simple one. It is not that psychedelics are good or that they are dangerous, though they are demonstrably both under different conditions. The lesson is something more specific and more uncomfortable, that there exist tools powerful enough to alter the fundamental parameters of human consciousness, and that the history of every institution that has encountered such tools is a history of people discovering that power does not come with instructions. The molecule is still here. The questions it raises about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between chemistry and experience, about who has the right to alter their own mind and under what conditions, have not been answered. Albert Hofmann lived to be 102 and spent most of those years hoping that the world would eventually find a responsible way to ask them. There is a certain cosmic irony in the fact that the man who accidentally invented the 20th century's most notorious mind-altering substance went on to become one of the longest-lived chemists in recorded history. Albert Hofmann was born in 1896 and died in 2008 at the age of 102, which means he spent more than 6 decades watching the molecule he created in a basal laboratory become a cultural earthquake, a government weapon, a criminal offence, a spiritual sacrament, and eventually a subject of renewed medical interest, all without ever quite losing his original sense that LSD was, at its core, something genuinely important that the world had never quite learned how to handle responsibly. Hofmann's relationship with LSD across those 6 decades was complex in a way that defied simple categorization. He was not an advocate for recreational use. He was not comfortable with the counterculture's approach to psychedelics, the mass consumption, the lack of preparation, the absence of the careful, intentional framework he believed was essential for the experience to be beneficial rather than harmful. He watched the 1960s unfold with the mixed feelings of a parent who's released something into the world and finds that the world is doing things with it that were never quite intended. He described LSD as his problem child, repeatedly, with an affection that never entirely obscured his genuine concern about where the child had ended up. At the same time, Hofmann never wavered in his belief that LSD was profoundly important and that its criminalization was a tragedy, not a moral tragedy in the sense of an injustice to the people who wanted to use it recreationally, but a scientific and therapeutic tragedy in the sense that substances with genuine healing potential had been removed from the toolkit of medicine for political reasons. He spent decades advocating for the resumption of psychedelic research, writing and speaking about the therapeutic and spiritual value he believed LSD could have in the right conditions with the right preparation and the right guidance. He met with researchers, attended conferences, and corresponded with a wide range of people who were working to restore legitimate scientific investigation to the field he had inadvertently created. In 2006, at the age of 100, Hofmann attended a symposium in Basel, organised to mark the 100th anniversary of his birth and to survey the state of psychedelic research. The gathering brought together researchers from Johns Hopkins, from MAPS, from universities across Europe, the people who are cautiously, carefully rebuilding the scientific foundation for psychedelic therapy. Hofmann sat at the front and listened and spoke, a century old, the accidental architect of a global cultural phenomenon, watching the world he'd set in motion perhaps finally beginning to find its equilibrium. He died 2 years later at home in the Swiss countryside in the spring of 2008. His last years had included regular walks in the forest near his home, which he described as producing experiences of wonder and connectedness that needed no chemical assistance. The man who discovered the most powerful psychedelic known to science spent his final decades finding the same quality of experience in the ordinary world. Make of that what you will. Long before psychedelics became a shorthand for 1960s excess, writers were approaching them with the same methodical curiosity they brought to everything else that seemed to illuminate something true about human experience. Aldous Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception in 1954 with the precision of a man filing a careful report from a territory no map had yet reached. Hunter S. Thompson dissolved the boundaries between journalism and hallucination so thoroughly in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas that it became impossible to say where the reporting ended and the experience began. Ken Kesey used what he had felt under psychedelics to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a novel about institutional control and the suppression of human consciousness that did not mention LSD once and was entirely about it. The literary response to psychedelics was not uniform. Different writers took different things from the experience and expressed them in forms that had very little to do with each other. Huxley approached mescaline as a philosopher and produced a philosophical essay, careful, referenced, grounded in the traditions of mystical literature and perceptual psychology. Thompson approached LSD and a significant quantity of other substances as a journalist covering the American dream, and produced a work of gonzo fiction that was simultaneously funnier and more politically serious than it appeared on first reading. Kesey took his experiences and embedded them in a novel whose surface story, a psychiatric ward, a charismatic patient, a repressive institution, encoded everything the psychedelic experience had taught him about consciousness, conformity, and the violence of systems that demand normalcy. The beat writers who preceded the psychedelic era, Ginsberg, Kerouac, Burroughs, created the cultural atmosphere in which the psychedelic movement would eventually grow, not because they were primarily psychedelic writers, but because they had already established the principle that the interior life was worthy of serious literary attention, and that altered states of consciousness were legitimate territory for artistic exploration. Allen Ginsberg's introduction to LSD, which came through Leary's Harvard Circle in the early 1960s, produced a direct connection between the beat literary tradition and the emerging psychedelic culture. Ginsberg became one of the most visible public advocates for psychedelics, appearing at protests and political events and poetry readings with an enthusiasm that was partly strategic and partly the genuine conviction of a man who believed he had encountered something important. The literature that emerged from the psychedelic era is still being assessed. Some of it has dated badly. The most earnest and explicitly psychedelic works, the ones that tried to recreate the experience in prose, have aged in the way that things designed for a specific altered state tend to age when read in the ordinary one. But the works that used the psychedelic experience as a lens rather than a subject, that took what the experience revealed about consciousness, about conformity, about the arbitrary nature of consensus reality, and embedded it in narratives that could be encountered without chemical assistance, have proved considerably more durable. They are still in print, they are still being read, they are still producing the particular quality of unease that comes from a book that makes you suspect the world you have been assuming is the world is a somewhat smaller room than you thought. One of the stranger and more consequential things that happened when LSD moved out of government laboratories and into the general population in the early 1960s was that a significant number of people who took it independently arrived at the same conclusion. Whatever this experience was, it felt religious. Not religious in the sense of a Sunday service or a memorized prayer, but religious in the older, stranger, harder to categorize sense, the sense of direct contact with something larger than the individual self, the dissolution of the ordinary boundaries between inside and outside, the sudden and overwhelming conviction that ordinary consciousness was a very small room in a very large house. This convergence of psychedelics and spirituality produced ripple effects across American religious life that are still moving through the culture today. The connection was not accidental or incidental. Leary and Alpert had explicitly framed psychedelic experience in spiritual terms from early in their Harvard work, drawing on the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a guide to navigating psychedelic states, and arguing that what was occurring in a well-conducted LSD session was structurally identical to what the mystical traditions of multiple cultures had described as enlightenment, liberation, or union with the divine. This framing was attractive to people who had grown up in conventional Western religious traditions and found them experientially hollow, who believed intellectually in the existence of something beyond ordinary reality, but had never felt it directly, and were now, suddenly, feeling it with an intensity that made the question of whether it was real feel somewhat secondary to the question of what to do with it. Richard Alpert processed his own psychedelic experiences by travelling to India and studying with a teacher named Neem Karoli Baba, eventually returning to the United States as Ram Dass, a name given to him by his teacher, meaning servant of God, and writing a book called Be Here Now that became one of the foundational texts of the American spiritual counterculture and has never gone out of print. Ram Dass became one of the most significant bridges between the psychedelic movement and the broader turn toward Eastern spirituality that characterized the 1970s and 80s, and his trajectory from Harvard psychologist to Hindu devotee illustrated in concentrated form what was happening across an entire generation of Westerners who had taken LSD and ended up somewhere they had not expected to be. The New Age movement that emerged in the 1970s drew heavily, if often indirectly, from the spiritual vocabulary that the psychedelic era had introduced to mainstream culture. Ideas about the interconnectedness of all things, about the primacy of subjective experience, about the inadequacy of materialist frameworks for understanding human consciousness. All of these had been circulating in Western culture before LSD, but the psychedelic movement had given them a visceral, personal, first-person urgency that no amount of reading could fully replicate. The person who had experienced the dissolution of the boundary between self and universe while sitting on a California hillside in 1967 was not going to be easily talked out of the conviction that something real had happened. Regardless of what the neuroscience textbooks said about serotonin receptors, any honest accounting of LSD's history has to make room for the part that the counterculture's most enthusiastic advocates sometimes glossed over, and the government's most aggressive opponents occasionally exaggerated for their own purposes. The simple, documented fact that LSD could, for some people in some circumstances, be genuinely harmful. The bad trip was not a myth invented by nervous parents or anti-drug campaigns. It was a real and sometimes devastating experience. Hours of terror, paranoia, and psychological disintegration that left some people shaken for days and a smaller number affected for much longer. The question of who was at risk, under what conditions, and what responsible use actually meant was one that the culture surrounding LSD engaged with inconsistently, and the legal system refused to engage with at all. The phenomenology of the bad trip is worth describing plainly, because it is not adequately captured by the phrase bad trip, which sounds like a disappointing holiday. A difficult LSD experience could involve hours of absolute certainty that one was dying, going permanently insane, or trapped forever in a reality that bore no relationship to the one inhabited before the drug was taken. Time distortion meant that an experience lasting 8 hours could feel from the inside like an eternity with no end. The dissolution of the ordinary sense of self, The same phenomenon that produced feelings of mystical unity in favourable circumstances could produce, in unfavourable ones, a terrifying sense of non-existence, of having lost the self without anything to replace it. People in the grip of severe LSD experiences had jumped from windows in the conviction that they could fly, had walked into traffic in states of complete dissociation from physical reality, had spent hours in states of paranoid terror that left lasting psychological marks. The factors that predicted a difficult experience were, by the 1960s, reasonably well understood by researchers even if they were poorly communicated to the general public. Set and setting, the mindset of the person taking the drug and the physical and social environment in which it was taken were the most significant variables. A person who was psychologically stable, adequately prepared, in a safe environment with trusted companions, was significantly less likely to have a severely distressing experience than a person who was already anxious, who had taken an unexpectedly large dose, who was in an unfamiliar or threatening environment, or who was predisposed to psychosis. The underground LSD distribution system, operating without quality control or dosage information, produced all of the worst-case versions of these variables simultaneously. A small but real subset of people who had difficult LSD experiences developed lasting psychological symptoms, prolonged psychotic episodes, persistent perceptual disturbances, anxiety disorders that bore a credible relationship to what had happened during the experience. The phenomenon known as HPPD, or hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, affects a minority of LSD users who continue to experience visual disturbances long after the drug has left their system. The research on the actual prevalence of LSD-induced lasting harm, as distinguished from the prevalence of LSD use followed by lasting harm that may have had other causes, is less clear than advocates on either side of the debate typically acknowledge. What is clear is that the substance was powerful enough to cause real damage to some people, that the conditions of unguided, uncontrolled recreational use maximised rather than minimised that risk, and that the legal framework that criminalised possession and research alike did nothing to address it. As of the 1920s, the 21st century's own strange and turbulent decade, LSD occupies a genuinely peculiar position in the world. It remains a Schedule I controlled substance in the United States, meaning it is officially classified alongside heroin as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. It is illegal to manufacture, possess, or distribute in most countries, and yet simultaneously it is the subject of an expanding body of legitimate clinical research, the inspiration for billion-dollar technology companies whose founders have spoken openly about its influence, the daily practice of a growing number of people who microdose it for focus and mood, and the spiritual cornerstone of several religious traditions that have applied for, and in some cases received, legal protections for their sacramental use. The microdosing phenomenon, taking subperceptual doses of LSD, typically around 10 micrograms on a regular schedule, emerged from the technology culture of Silicon Valley in the early 2010s and spread rapidly into the broader professional world. Advocates reported improvements in focus, creativity, mood regulation, and general cognitive performance without the full perceptual effects of a standard dose. The research on microdosing is still in its early stages, and the placebo-controlled studies have produced more ambiguous results than the enthusiastic personal testimonial suggested, but the practice has normalized LSD use in professional contexts in a way that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. People who would never have considered themselves part of any counterculture tradition are discussing their microdosing protocols at breakfast meetings and in business podcasts with a matter-of-factness that suggests the cultural conversation around the substance has shifted substantially. The clinical research that resumed in the early 2000s has continued to expand. Studies on LSD specifically, as distinguished from psilocybin, which received the bulk of early renewed research attention, are now being conducted at institutions across Europe and North America, with results that continue to support what the researchers of the 1950s had found, that the substance has genuine therapeutic potential in carefully managed conditions, particularly for anxiety, depression and addiction. The regulatory pathway toward approved LSD therapy is longer and more uncertain than the pathway for psilocybin or MDMA, but it is no longer regarded as a fantasy by people who work in the field. The legal landscape is shifting, unevenly and slowly, in ways that reflect the broader reassessment of the war on drugs that has been gathering momentum since the early 2000s. Oregon decriminalized possession of small amounts of all controlled substances in 2020, a policy change whose implementation has been complicated, but whose philosophical significance is considerable. Several cities across the United States have deprioritized enforcement of psychedelic drug laws. The conversation in mainstream policy circles about rescheduling psychedelics from Schedule 1 to a classification that would permit medical use has moved from the fringe to something approaching the centre. None of this resolves the fundamental questions that LSD has been raising since April 19th, 1943. The questions about consciousness, about the nature of human experience, about who has the right to alter their own mind, and under what conditions, these remain as open and as contested as they have ever been. Albert Hofmann spent 65 years with those questions after his bicycle day, and he did not claim to have answered them. He claimed only that they were worth asking, that the substance that had introduced them to him was worth taking seriously, and that the world's failure to do so carefully and respectfully had produced a great deal of unnecessary suffering on all sides. He was right about all three. The conversation he inadvertently started in a Swiss laboratory more than 80 years ago is still going. It shows no signs of stopping. And somewhere tonight, in a city or a field or a quiet room, someone is asking the same questions he asked, in the only way that has ever made them feel fully real. And so here we are, at the end of a very long, very strange, very human story. Think about what you have just travelled through tonight. A Swiss chemist who accidentally discovered the most powerful psychedelic known to science, and spent the next 65 years wondering if the world would ever figure out what to do with it responsibly. A government that tried to weaponize a substance it could not control, and in doing so seeded the very counterculture it was most afraid of. A generation of young people who took a molecule and built a movement around it, imperfect, chaotic, sometimes reckless, and genuinely convinced that what they had found mattered. Researchers who spent careers documenting therapeutic potential only to watch it buried under a scheduling, classification designed for political purposes rather than scientific ones. Musicians who heard something in the psychedelic experience and translated it into sound that is still playing. Writers who tried to put it into words. Programmers who built it into machines. Priests and philosophers who recognized it as something they already had a name for, even if the name had never quite fit this particular shape of the thing. And through all of it, the molecule itself, unchanged, indifferent to the uses it was put to, present in all of these stories simultaneously, asking the same question in every context it entered. What are you, really, underneath the story you've been telling yourself about yourself? That is not a small question. It is, arguably, the largest question there is. And the fact that a compound smaller than a grain of salt synthesized by accident in a laboratory in Basel in 1938 has been asking it to the 20th and 21st centuries with such persistence and such force, that is one of the stranger and more remarkable facts in the history of human experience. The people who were hurt by LSD were real. The people who were helped by it were real. The government officials who abused it, and the researchers who were silenced by its criminalization, and the patients who never received treatments that might have helped them, all real. History does not resolve neatly into a lesson, and this history less than most. It is a story full of brilliance and recklessness and cruelty and hope and genuine discovery and genuine harm, and most of the people in it were doing what people usually do, their best within the limits of what they understood, in conditions they did not fully control. So tonight, as you settle deeper into wherever you are, your bed, your couch, the dark, quiet room where you come to let the day go, maybe hold that gently. The strangeness of the world, the fact that reality is considerably more mysterious than it usually feels, the fact that human beings, across every culture and every century, have always found ways to ask the largest questions, and have always found, in the asking, that they are less alone than they thought. The lights in Basel are long dark, the bicycle is long still, but the question is still moving, still asking, still waiting for an answer that may not be coming any time soon. Sleep well, you have earned it.